Hello, my name is Stephen Cretney, and I'm with the West Kootenay Climate Hub. The Climate Hub brings together various local organizations and individuals to accelerate climate action in our region. This volunteer-driven hub facilitates connections and collaborations, including hosting these monthly webinars. Today, Jan Inglis is joining us to explore the concept of bioregionalism within our community. And we'll also hear from Ramona Faust about the importance of preserving healthy watersheds and our relationship with them. So Jan's work is being motivated by questions regarding how people faced challenges and potentially evolved ways to transform the seemingly overwhelming situations they find themselves in. This inquiry has led her through a background as a somatic psychotherapist, grassroots environmental educator, and public engagement practitioner, weaving in studies in complexity science, cultural evolution, commons-based economics, community art, and bioregionalism. So welcome, Jan. I will get your PowerPoint up and going right now.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate the work that it takes to pull something like this together. So really appreciating the Climate Hub for doing that. And while I'm just getting ready to start talking, I was wondering if everybody would just write, because it'll be relevant to our focusing, if they could just put into the chat what water body they're closest to, what do you identify with, what creek or stream or river or lake or ocean that you feel that you're closest to. You could just stick that in the chat. That would be great to see. I'm actually out in Victoria right now, but I'll be back in the Kootenays up on uphill Nelson very soon. So I'm going to talk about bioregionalism as a big philosophical aspect of that, and then kind of zoom down into more specifics locally. And then it'll be great to pass it over to Ramona, who will also talk about local as well as larger regional connections regarding watersheds. So bioregionalism in a lot of ways is about a narrative of relationship. And it's about the area that is formed by the geological, ecological, and cultural connectedness, so that it's like each area has its unique geology, ecology, and cultural network. And so bioregion is life region. And so how do we relate together regarding that life region, and how is it that we have become in some ways quite disconnected from that? So the watersheds are very important in terms of the formation of the geology, the ecology, and definitely the culture. So next slide. So this is a map that we're familiar with. We probably orient around it quite a bit. There's the arbitrary linear static grid of lines that have created a country separation as well as provinces and states. And it sort of lays over top of a more dynamic system of watersheds. And this is just North America. And it would be, most of this would have been formed maybe 200 years ago or so. And then, of course, world maps have similar linear lines, and they show a lot of those are still changing. And sometimes we can think of this as being, especially in North America, it's being, well, it's been there a long time. And yet, if we go to the next slide, which is exactly the same region, but this is the watersheds of this same region. And they are, of course, very, very ancient, million years ago. And they're also organic and dynamic and living systems. They show the interconnected life that's been where Indigenous people have traditionally lived in relationship to. That yellow section over on one side is the Columbia River Basin, and it's made up of pretty much the Columbia and the Fraser and the Skeena The Snake River runs into the Columbia River. That's that one piece over onto the side. And so if you could toggle back to the other map. Great, thank you. So good to have this support. So just having a sense of how familiar we are with this and really understanding how this has been designed over a period of time. And so the back and forth look at that is really helpful for us to get a sense of the narrative that is formed one and the narrative that is connected with the other one, and how we're sort of in between the narratives, and how the Indigenous narrative has been closer to the watershed map than this one, and yet the impact of this map on top of both the Indigenous cultures and on top of our relationship, no matter where we've lived, even if we're new immigrants into an area that we are sort of not seeing the connection. And so that sense of how we've become separate from our watersheds, how we've come separate to the geology and the ecology and the earlier cultures, and how we tend to operate from the structures that separate us, I think is really important to look at in terms of that big narrative of how are we moving forward with some of the decisions that are regarding impacts from the climate and the many other things that impact us. So just looking at this one and the sort of Western science approach to categorizing, reducing things so we could understand them, so they could be more efficient, so that we could understand a sense of how progress would be most efficiently operated, which has also created a sense of individualism and a sense of competition. And so let's go to the next slide, back to the watershed slide. Thanks. Whereas this one carries that sense of relationship and organicness if we see it. And I sort of liken these two to going back and forth between holistic medicine in terms of our bodies as being having these aspects that are very interconnected, and it's very difficult in a holistic understanding of our bodies to think that we can just divide it up and take out parts and not think that we're impacting the whole. And yet, in some ways, we can do that with how the previous map shows us, with like, it's more like the tradition, the conservative medicine, medical approach, in which we can just say, well, we understand what the problem is. We need to just fix it by looking at the symptoms and changing that. So I'm kind of bringing in that because I think over the last quite a few years, we have started to understand the implications of holistic medicine and how our connection with our bodies really makes a difference in our well-being. And it's like, okay, can we shift that a bit more and get that same connection with the earth that we're right next to, and be able to understand it in terms of that integrative, living, connected, relational aspect of the earth that we live on. And I think once you start doing that, you think, well, how could we ever not have known this? And I think that's a little bit like the shock and awareness that have come over a lot of us that are new immigrants to this area, when we realize, how could we ever not have known about how the Indigenous people were treated, and what were the belief systems that made us so separate from that experience? And so that we could actually move into a way of colonizing. And so I think the same thinking has impacted how can we also become so extractive in our relationship with the earth around us, and have this sense of not only white supremacy over people, but also human dominance over the earth and other species. So I think that there is a correlation there that is kind of a really big picture correlation, but does bring us down to how do we actually make choices and changes and relationships in our daily activities now, wherever we live. So the next slide. So this is an area that is called, it's been given the name Cascadia, and the water that flows from the Rocky Mountains down towards the Pacific, and the I think I said earlier that the Columbia, Fraser, and the Skeena, I meant that in the Cascadia region, not in the Columbia River. So the Columbia River at the bottom and then further up. So this has a connection, an affinity from geological aspects, as well as the ecologies, which change quite a bit throughout, but there's different connections in that, and then cultural affinities that have happened over many, many years. So this has become considered to be one of the regions. And maybe to toggle back up to the other watershed map. So the area that you can see, the kind of bright purplish area, is around the Great Lakes. And I'll mention that hopefully at the very end, if I have some time, to say that that area has also been looking at as being, how does that region start to think together about its own region and work together on that? So let's go down to slide 5. And so watershed. So the term watershed is like really the shedding of water off the rock. When this area was formed from tectonic plates or glaciation, the sheer rock was forced up, and when the rains went over it, the rain just ran down and shed it off, went down into the ocean and became salinated. So the sense of how do these rocky slopes hold that moisture through lichens and moss, and that built up more and more other types of habitation that eventually became trees and habitat for many other species. And there's places where, and along the valleys where there's not just watershed, but actually water catchment. It's like really understanding how the ecological investment to create ways of holding water, to create ways that life could be formed over a period of time. And that it's this interrelationship of all this that created the way by which life could be formed and life could continue to be seeking life. And so how easy it is to forget this long-term investment, many years to create the life that now supports us. And so even just being up in my own yard, up in Creek Street, and I look out over, I know I'm on the edge of the Selkirk Mountains, and I know that Cottonwood Creek is down below me, and that the Cottonwood Creek runs into the Kootenai River that runs into the Columbia River, and that therefore everything that I have happening on that soil, and that is the rain that I receive and the moisture that goes into the garden and the moisture that leaves that area, is all part of that large system. And that has taken me a long time to get, and I've lived on that property a long time. But just that awareness has rooted me into a place like I haven't been before. And it's supported my sense of connecting into place. So the next slide, I'm going to show a couple of clips from a video by Jeanette Armstrong, who is a recognized person within the Sayux Okanagan Nation. And I asked her if I could use a couple of clips, because they speak to, I think, a place in which we can get, as immigrants in the area, as settlers in the area, say, can we talk about stewarding and being close to our bioregion and taking care of it when really this is Indigenous land? And how do we understand that? Because we're trying not to, yet again, make assumptions about this land and understand it from a place of respecting the First Peoples. But I think she speaks to some of that conundrum. So Stephen, if you could just show both clips, and they speak to the reciprocity and relationship.
This is my granddaughter, some of my grandkids, and we're harvesting huckleberries, of course, there in the middle, and the salmon in our river. But one of the things that we know is that the way that we in our traditions are connected to the place that we're from is that we know that everything that is in place on these lands is knowledge. It's not just that they're there, it's that they are knowledge, and that knowledge is given by them about the specific place that we're in. And that's a real way to think about what Indigenous means, and why the different languages, why the different customs, and why the different cultures that are required by those living things that are there, and how they provide their gifts and their bounty to us. Our knowledge is constructed around that, is infused in our traditions, in our ceremonies, in our songs, in our dances, in all the things that we do and that we know as Indigenous people from a specific place. It's that place that has provided the language, the knowledge, the stories, all of those things that we do, even the things that we make, the things that are beautiful, that that inform us, and the things that take us into those spiritual realms that we know about as Scale people, as Indigenous people. And so what does that mean? Our view, the view that I come from is, and I'm talking about the Seal people, that everyone in that place needs to know that place in the same Indigenous way in order for it to be healthy. So what does that mean? If everyone, and we're talking about all the settlers that have come to be part of our land and reside with us or next to us, our view is that everyone in that place needs to know that place in the same way that we know it. In other words, what does that place require from us in how we need to be, how we need to take care of it, how we need to connect to it. So that, in terms of looking at, is what my main focus is. And when I use the word to indigenize a place, it doesn't mean to have people take over our culture and do the things that we do and think that they can do all of the things that are, spiritual, ceremonial, and so on without the people from those places doing them. That's, I think, one of the things that is misunderstood about indigenizing. When I talk about indigenizing, is what do people need to know about the living things in the places they occupy, the places they reside? What are the laws that require a healthy balance with those living things? That's what we're grappling with now at this time. In the topic of this dialogue, how do we repair? How do we make those changes in our communities, in our ways of doing things? And how do we help, make for a healthier balance in all the smaller spheres that we each occupy as an individual, or as a family, or as a community, or as an organization?
And Stephen, I think we'll just stop it at that one, because I'm realizing, looking at the time and thinking, let's just go on to the next slide. Sorry to throw you a curveball there, but that sort of feels like, yeah, that might be the right thing to do. So let's go into slide 7. So this is abrupt change into the mess, and it's by some called the polycrises that we're probably feeling, the impacts that one thing, the dominoes are falling together and over top of each other, and and this feeling of the overwhelm that can be there, that if the knowing that there's this, has a lot of this come because of living without being in relationship to place. And now we're in the mess. So how do we work with this? And how do we not just become overwhelmed with it? And I think that it does indicate, it can be overwhelming. It does feel like a place of alienation and a lack of agency. And what do we do and how do we respond to it? And I think a lot of ways of trying to respond to it are to go back into a fix-it mentality, set up some hierarchies, try to set up a program and do something that is not as relational to place and to people, but does force a project ahead. And we can get into competition about those projects, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really hard to find our way back to balance with this. And so I think it's like, how do we consciously look at how do we regenerate and restore and repair, not within this mess, but how do we look at how do we repair the conditions, the narrative that has got us into the mess that we're in. So next slide. And so coming to this great quote, I had got in touch with Jeanette and asked her if I could use the video, and also really appreciate having found this quote. And I think that the link to the video will be put in the chat so you can all watch it at some point and watch the whole thing. But so we need to have the land inside of us, which is not something, I mean, I think using that language, and I look at Suzanne Simard and the mother tree and how hard it was for her to get across, even with all the science she was doing, that trees collaborate, that there is this sense of a collective, collaborative effort that that we so have such a hard time with. And so to say we need to have the land inside of us is, I can feel it inside of myself, that sense of, oh, it's a woo-woo statement, I better not say it. And just reading how hard she worked with her science to get beyond that. So how do we do this so we can actually not just be sitting in nice circles chatting about it, but actually have it move into policy? So next slide. So I'm just going to go through some slides quickly of people gathering to actually have these conversations about what do we know about the place we live in? How do we take care of it? What's good about it? What's not good? What do we need to be doing next? Maps all over the place. So this is a group that I helped support get going in Victoria that's been looking at the watersheds here. And next slide. And here's some people working together out on the land and looking at how do they support that aspen forest moving ahead into the to occupy that area. And what are they looking, understanding how the soil works, how it holds moisture, how that impacts the climate in that region. Next slide. And here's, this was way back when I was doing some stuff with Friends of Kootenay Lake, and we were doing water samples, like how do we understand the lake better, which is really important for us to be living here. How do we know about that? And there's groups that are supporting that happening. And next slide. And here's a bunch of people working together, a youth working on a project here in Victoria on Bowker Creek, which runs through many of the municipalities. It's got garbage in it, has cement over top of it, and bit by bit, people are working on opening it up. And actually, it runs out along by Oak Bay, and salmon are already starting to come back up into it. So when I look at this type of work and the kind of connection and engagement, it does so much to bring back a sense of empowerment than the disempowerment of the story of the polycrises. And this is real learning, real together, doing work for restoration. And there's many groups here that are working on some. Certainly Ramona is going to be talking in a bit about the Watershed Collaborative, but wild site has been so active. There's the heroic efforts of the Save the Cottonwood Lake Initiative and local people that were really concerned about the forestry that was happening there and how they secured some of the aspects of the forest to protect that lake. And then there's a new project for about revitalizing Cottonwood Creek. There's the Slocan River Stream Keepers. There's the Kootenai Conservation Program. There's the Valhalla Foundation for Ecology. There's people looking at native plants gathering, and people that are birders that are concerned about habitat. There's people that have been working on old growth forest. So there's so much happening, and there's a vigor in that that's rising. I briefly wanted to just mention the small water cycle, because I think that's a lot of what we're working with. We know more about this large water cycle, but how do we bring it around to understanding this small water cycle? And again, I'm putting a link into the chat so people can look this up, but this is where we can actually be doing action on the ground that impacts the local climate here. By understanding how the soil works, how we can repair the soil so that it can absorb the water. So when these atmospheric rivers come, the soil can absorb that water, take it up through the trees. Evapotranspiration moves it into the clouds and back down into rain in the region, which then is part of this large water cycle that we probably know more about. It's a huge story, but I needed to throw in a slide to honor the amount of work that's happening there. And the next slide. So there's many forms of capital that keep a place healthy. We tend to keep moving towards financial capital, and these other ones need to be there and relating together. So those groups that I just showed pictures of are working together. They may be working specifically on ecological capital, but the other capitals come along with that work together. But I think that's one of the big issues that we're facing right now is that I've talked about the ecological layer and the geological layer, the ecological layer, but really it's the cultural work that we need to do to work together. And there's a sense of, we'll quickly go through the Bioregional Learning Center as a name, and then just probably finish off there, because I know that I want to hand the time over to Ramona. So the next slide. Back in the 1980s, Donella Meadows did so much work about the limits to growth and saying we need bioregional learning centers. So we don't just have silos of people doing things, and we weave ourselves together. And it's this work on the cultural level. How do we do governance differently? How do we do economics differently? And how do we not just, so I think it's a quick, Ramona and I were laughing earlier. It's like, there's so much that can be done if it wasn't for the people, but it is the people. It's how we work together that is the challenge. And it's like, that's the place of doing a lot of work. There is groups gathering in Cascadia. There's group gathering around the Great Lakes. There's a course coming up that's gathering people from around the world about how to set up bioregional learning centers. I can put some of those information, I'll send some of those informations out to you, but the Bioregional Learning Center one is coming up quite soon. So if that can be popped into the chat, if people want to go in and take a look around at that and some of the sites there. There's so many things happening, and there's so many people engaging with how do we learn to do this and how do we learn to do it together. I could probably rattle on for days, but I would love to get together when I'm back with people that are keen and want to say, let's talk about this. What do we do here? And possibly there can be an activation tour by regionals groupings around the Upper Columbia and the Upper Fraser of people who want to get together and talk. That's sort of how Cascadia got going. So I will pass it over to Ramona, or to Stephen, who will pass it over to Ramona. And maybe we'll have a question and answer later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jan. I will just get Ramona's slides and stuff up here. Just need a quick second here. So Ramona, now a director at the West Kootenay Watershed Collaborative, has contributed in many positive ways in our community for years. She has worked in forestry, education, social services, and community forestry. She spent 14 years as an RDCK director. Among her volunteer activities, Ramona advocated for the West Arm Park, was co-founder of the West Kootenay Eco Society, and has been on the board and advisor on nonprofits and local and provincial funding organizations. Yeah, welcome, Ramona. You are on mute.
Yes, I am. And sorry about that. With all of that lofty list of accomplishments, she is having trouble running her Zoom. So anyway, thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here. And I think I am having a bit of a Zoom crisis because I put a background in behind me. So a little bit about the Watershed Collaborative. In 2017, we held an initial meeting at the Harrop Hall with people from all up and down Kootenay Lake and Kootenay River. And the idea was to see how we could collaborate, which is much fits into what Jan has just been talking about, which I find very exciting. And we paused for a year and gathered experts in the field and community members. And as a regional district director, I had about 7 different watershed groups come to me with a sense of crisis and urgency. And as a regional district director, at the time, we were not pursuing watershed security at the regional district. And subsequently, we did. However, it gave me pause, and I felt the only way that we could address this was together. And having been on the West Arm Watershed Alliance and groups to try and save watersheds by creating the West Arm Park, I realized that we needed information and we needed to move together on a way forward. Next slide. And so in 2018, we all met again, and we decided that we would pursue hard science and nature-directed planning and stand behind that in order to provide a united front to upper levels of government, so to speak. So the West Kootenay Watershed Collaborative also realized as it was forming that our First Nations partners had been advised all along of what we were doing, but they had not had an opportunity to be included. Distance and their workload is ginormous. And so we remain open and available and have had some meetings with First Nations and keep them apprised of what's going along, and however we can support them, we will. And that remains a vital part of our philosophy. Next slide, please. So our motto is empowering communities in the defense of watersheds and land resources. And by that, what we mean is we are excited to be developing some outreach programs for communities up and down the Kootenay Lake and River. And we are also committed to following hard science in order to reach out to government and communities with an opportunity to maybe look at things a little bit differently. And ultimately, we hope to be able to change regulation or legislation where it's warranted. And this is an exciting time because for the first time in 20 years, the government appears to be open to looking at a different way of managing biodiversity and managing forestry. And any day now, I suspect that there will be an announcement on the watershed security work that the government's been doing, both a fund for it and a new set of regulations, we hope. And so it's timely that we're have formed in the last 2 years, 2022, and that we formed subject to having been lucky enough to receive funding through the West Kootenay Eco Society, now Neighbours United. They agreed to hold our funding, and we were able to create 2 projects for preliminary ecosystem-based plans in Laird and Glade Creeks. And out of that project also was a requirement to look at a sub-regional governance model. And so we're very happy to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So this was some of the mess in 2017 that we were all talking about. Obviously, everyone knows about the sadness that came from climate change in Johnson's Landing. That's not pictured here, but these are more related to climate and man-made occurrences. And so all of these communities up and down the lake had some effect, and others that are not listed here as well. So there's a Laird Creek, which is the subject of one of the preliminary ecosystem-based plans, or as we call it, nature-directed plans now. And next slide, please. So our plans are, as you can see here, pretty much a 3-year plan. We do have a strategic plan. We will be revisiting it soon. And these are the things that we hope we will be able to accomplish in the next years. And we have a collaborative relationship with UBC Hydrology Lab. And so we will be focusing a lot of our energy fundraising and all of that in order to carry out work in Laird Creek and Redfish Creek, looking at how climate and hydrology interact. Dr. Alila's lab looks at things a little differently than traditional hydrology, and he is making waves across the province. We are going to be entertaining a master's student and a PhD student in order to carry out that research over the next few years. So stay tuned for that. And we will be doing science labs, science pubs, and we're going to spread them along Kootenay Lake. it having them in different locations with different subject matter. We're hoping the first one is Robert Gray speaking on wildfire in June. So we're just trying to put that together. And of course, all of this that you read here is very dependent on us having the person capacity to carry these things out. So I think my next plea will be to perhaps join us in some capacity as a volunteer or a board member, or join the organization. Next slide, please. And sorry, I'm just having a bit of trouble seeing this at scale. There we go. The science of attribution is quite complex, which is what Dr. Alila is instructing his students on, and also publishing papers for the last 20 years. It is best explained perhaps in this small news clip, and there is an embedded video which is interesting to look at. And basically, we've used chronological pairing, which talks about 100-year intervals between slides, or 200-year intervals between slides and landslides, and decided whether we should log an area based on that. And he used frequency pairing. It's not new science, it's what climate scientists use. And the difference is that you also insert chance and ecological opportunity into what can create slides, landslides, and floods. So it's complex, and we're forever trying to make it more simplistic. So wish us luck in that, because it's a difficult concept. But yeah, if you want to take a photo of that or whatever you'd like to do, or we can drop it in the chat later. Next slide, please. So we invite you to follow us. That's our website, and it's also in the chat. We're on Facebook. I'm sure that soon we will also have a presence on other social media platforms. We're just getting all of that set up. So if any of this interests you, I really hope that you can join us in some way. And I'm perfectly happy to take a phone call or an email in the future. And I can drop my email in the chat, and we can talk more about this concept. So thanks very much, everyone. And that's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Ramona. We'll make sure, I don't know, I haven't been able to see anything what's going on in the chat, but if we haven't got those links in there, we will put them in there. We are going to move on to question and answers. And if you do have a question, you can either type it in there into the chat and I'll come to it, or you can unmute right now and jump in and ask. Maybe the presentations were so thorough and good that no questions are even coming up. Maggie has a question there, I can see.
Hi, yeah, I found that it was really interesting. Thank you very much, both Jan and Ramona. I would have loved to heard more from Jan, actually, and I think there's a whole key part of it around the cultural, what Jan was saying around the cultural and social dynamics that it would be really great as a group to have that discussion someday, because I think, you know, when we talk about climate change, it's much bigger than just the scientific and environmental implications. Yeah, so that's just, I guess it's more of a comment. More Jan is what I'm saying.
Nah, we all need more Jan. Jan, did you want to say anything about that cultural thing right here, right now?
Sure. Thank you so much, Maggie. It's like, yeah, there's so much. I mean, it's so big that we do not know how to work well together because we're so used to being kind of individual and separate and hierarchically controlled. And so the kind of groups that are gathering are all about how do we decentralize and how do we be in relationship with each other and the places that we're in. And how do we learn to do that messy thing and vulnerable thing? And yet, the people that are gathering, I am impressed. I mean, we've got people coming in that are permaculture people and forestry people and restore the water cycle people and techies, young people that have been working in the tech industry, people that are doing media work that are coming in. We've got a whole bunch of people that are looking at how do we do economics differently. So there is funding to actually support people to do the kind of weaving together of these conversations. And so it's many layers of conversations of how we kind of shed some of that. It's just me here and I can do whatever I want versus that relational aspect, which does take us into being more vulnerable. And but the movement out of modernity, I think, into a more relational way of being is necessary. And it's why I looked years ago when I was doing climate work in the 80s and 90s and and so much of it, we end up being caught up into the same system that was so challenging us because it was one that is based on needing to prove things economically, prove things technically, prove things scientifically, which is all important. Still would want to do it. We still need to do that. And yet we're so separate from each other in how we do work relationally. So there's such a necessity of needing to learn that because we are not going to be able to figure out how to do these projects together unless we can actually work with each other in place on the land that we love. That's kind of a rambly, vague, but it's like there's methods of doing this. So many people that are coming forth we have been working in convening and facilitating, and people that have been working in mental health and spiritual well-being that are bringing some of those skills into the work that people are trying to do ecologically. And so I see a weaving together there. So it's not just working in your silo of how do I do my private practice as a counselor or my private practice as a convener of groups, but how do I consider myself as working in a bioregion to do that with other people and helping them do that work?
Nice. I really like that, Jan. Keith, you had your hand up, and I do see that there are some questions in the chat that I will get to after as well. But Keith.
Well, thanks for both those presentations, Jan and Ramona. And it's interesting. I have a question to raise sort of that addresses that. Jan, you talked about the bigger Cascadia bioregion, and Ramona, you talked a lot more about a much more local sort of subset. Jan, you also had an analysis between the big water cycle and the local water cycle. And I wonder if your bioregionalism, if looking at it sort of more locally, I find it easier to grasp and see the local patterns that I can understand and with my neighbors better. So there is the big scale, of course, but it's the local scale that it seems most interesting to me.
I can respond unless there's something, Ramona, that you wanted to say on that. I've already talked quite a bit.
I can just say a little bit, and then why don't you take a crack at it too? So I've been, as was said, doing this work for a very long time, and part of my history as a regional district director, I was on the Columbia River Treaty Local Government Committee. So it's always on my mind. And I think that in our organization, I know that our chair is very interested in the Cascadia concept, and that we're all very aware that as these watersheds and the people that rely on them are impacted, not only are we talking about drinking water, which I think is not only, by the way, but we're talking about the levels of water that are available to the main water bodies that run through the Columbia. We're talking about glacier melt. And it is such a intricate connection, as Janice said, between the micro and the macro. If those south-facing slopes on the west arm of the Kootenay River, Kootenay Lake, start to dry, that is less water for fish, and that is less water for the lake. And we saw the devastating low water in the Arrow District this year. And so it is very hard to separate those things, but sometimes you have to start at the root. And the root is the water that's available to feed the larger waterways. And so that's sort of the difference, I would say, in working at a local level, always with the macro in mind.
Yeah, so well said. Because we're living in an interconnected living system, and so the boundaries are there that help us understand what membrane we're kind of living in, and who we relate to, and how we're similar to other people, and that is formed by specific creeks and rivers and aspects of watersheds, but they're all nested in other ones. And so but it does give a place of, let's look at the land and the water here, and then how do we know how that relates to another one? So I think that the groups that are forming, like Regenerate Cascadia, is decided, okay, let's set up something that says, how do we all connect, and how do we share resources so that we can actually do on the ground work, so it's not taking people away from that, but how do we find who else is doing something? How did they manage to deal with a municipal issue? How did they figure out how to learn how to understand the relationship between the types of trees that are in that region and how that impacts the way that water is held? Or how did you manage to work out a group that was at such a contentious place and really were stuck that we weren't able to do the work we really need to do because we had this stuck place? How did you manage to do that? So it's kind of like sharing that, and also knowing that we're not all by ourselves. So much of the communication has gone from individual groups, quite often in competition with each other, to government to get funding, and then back to the individual group, back in competition again with each other. So it's like, how do we weave that differently so that there's that relational quality, that we're all living in place together? And yes, we need funding, and probably we'll still be dealing with that competitive thing, but there's I hate kind of even going towards funding because it makes you go like, oh, money out there. But there's now shifting of funding towards looking at how do we fund bioregional work, because there's a fear that we're going to lose the whole thing if we aren't able to understand how to hold our water back, how to make decisions about taking care and stewarding our commons together. So supporting both the cultural aspects of that, the decision-making aspects of that, the capacity building that needs to be there for us to work together, as well as the on-the-ground understanding of how do you hold water, and how do you find ways of supporting growth in food, etc. So it's like those very tangible things plus the culture that weaves together to do that. And it feels that there's an energy flowing around that is both local and global. So there's like little pockets here and there happening around, and that's inspiring. But we need to go back to our little pockets and work for sure.
Okay. I just want to make a note that it is top of the hour. I'm going to keep going here because we still have a couple questions, but I understand if people need to drop off, it is 1 o'clock. Is there a bioregional learning center in the West Kootenays already?
There's pieces of it all over the place. It's like if we were talking together about that, then whether it's a center like it's in a building, but there is this network of people who have been here for so long, whether they're Indigenous people or more recent immigrants who know so much about this area, who've been fighting to save it. I don't have a sense that we see ourselves together as a bioregional learning center. And I think it would be great for us to start thinking that way, and also doing the messy collaborative work that it requires to do that kind of work together.
Yeah, totally. Louis Philippe asked, how can we leverage historical knowledge to better approach the local people regarding necessary climate adaptation measures together? It's in the chat. How can we leverage historical knowledge to better approach the local people regarding necessary climate adaptation measures together? And if you want to unmute and rephrase that at all or anything or add to that, feel free. But Jan or Ramona, feel free to.
Again, Ramona, do you want to take that one for part of that? Because I know I've been talking quite a bit again.
I think she's saying go for it, Jan.
Yeah, so historical, for one thing, I'm thinking, okay, where do we start with historical? And how do we use that? It's like, I think that it's increasing the sense of how this region has operated before, how it was like before climate impacts. I think even knowing that and grounding into that experience hopefully impacts how we see ourselves together in this region. I don't know if that's getting quite to the specifics of how do we, I mean, I think that's a lot of what the West Kootenay Climate Hub has been doing and various climate groups around the region have been doing, is weaving together the Indigenous knowledge, weaving together how is this area, how did it operate before we were impacted so much by climate, and being able to understand the baseline of what a healthy living system is like, surely helps us be informed about the kind of changes that we feel we need to lobby for. I may have been a bit vague, sorry.
Well, there's a lot there, right? That's a whole working group or presentation that could be dived into that. One other question came in. Do either of you have figures about how low our water levels are in the Kootenays? The Slocan River and Herd Creek are really low. Any?
I personally do not. And I know that, there are, Living Lakes has been doing lake and creek monitoring in our area, and like the Slocan Valley as well. By our area, I mean the West Kootenay or Central Kootenay. I think perhaps they have some roll-up reports now. I know that, we saw it most pronounced up in the Arrow Lakes area, and there wasn't much information about the rest of the water system. I would be interested to follow BC Hydro's public engagement sessions this year. I think they usually take place in June, May or June, and perhaps they have some edification on how low the main lakes and rivers in their operating area went. And that's about as close as I can get to being helpful.
Well, luckily, Kayla, who I've been jealous of sitting there in the sun all this whole presentation, she just put in a link to the Kootenay water levels in the chat there. It's a Fortis site that lists all the data and stuff.
And so the question of how do we take this data that is there and then make it, own it as people of the region, and so make sense of that together, because it's so great that there is data. And then how do we take and work with that and how that inform our relationship with place, I think is a gap that can be there.
Yeah, and this water level, well, just at a quick look, I don't know how depth it goes. There is years saying what, 1973, so like it's been measured for many years and has been kept track of. So yeah, that does speak to that. I see in the chat, and we're going to close this up right away here, but Mark has mentioned in the chat that storytelling is such an important piece of it too. The story we're telling ourselves about who, what, and where we are, how we develop a compelling new story. How do we develop a compelling new story that provides an alternative to the current trajectory? Thank you, Mark. And I did see that Austin, you were kind of waving your hand. Did you have something you want to say? And this will be the final comment, and then well, unless it's a question, then there can be an answer. But.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I did have a question, and I just wanted to say I really took a lot from the Jan, your diagram that included the various types of capital, and it seems that we really need to reinforce all other types of capital if we're to make arguments for the value of doing this, because that's what's kind of being missed by a lot of the regulation. That was a comment, but my question is more specific. It was, I live near Kokanee Creek, and I just wonder, I know there's been some interventions there, starting with kind of the original settler straightening of Kokanee Creek. And I wonder if there's kind of some repair of it to encourage salmon spawning. I wonder if there's more projects or thinking in the works about how to hold more water in those wetlands.
You need my old number.
Ramona?
At this point, I'm not aware of any initiatives that are specifically working on Kokanee Creek, but you make an excellent point. Along with redfish, Kokanee is one of the channels that we need to pay attention to as far as fish are concerned. And I am not entirely sure what is being done to monitor Kokanee Creek in the upper reaches. And if you have locations that you've seen that you feel would be good for some kind of intervention, then by all means get in touch with us, or get in touch with the Ministry of Environment, or Joanne Siderius, actually, that runs the visitor center, or the nature center, as it's now called. I've obviously lived here too long, but I think that that is a very interesting question, because we tend to think somebody's looking after Kokanee because it's in a park, but we don't really know that.
It also seems to me that because it's in a park, there's not so much contention around it. People, it may be a simpler proposition to try to make further intervention there. And there's a lot of kind of latent oxbows. I think it's still pretty straight compared to how it once was flowing. And there's a lot of kind of wetland there that's kind of laying fallow in a certain sense as far as water retention. Just a curiosity there. So maybe I'll learn more at the Nature Center. Thanks, Ramona.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Jan. Thanks for everyone who's commented and added questions. We do have to carry on with talks about water. We've got on April 19th, Greg is going to be talking about the Columbia River Treaty and climate change. So it carries on to some degree this, not in the same way that we're actually talking about it right now. But yes, thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. It's springy and sunny out there, and man, I am so jealous of Kayla sitting there in the sun.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's been great to feel this interest that's there.
Thank you, and thank you to the Climate Hub and everybody that put work into this happening. So thank you.